So, Mike, in last week's episode, we were kind of processing the US election. It's fair to say. And, one of the ways you can process your emotions, you will know this, I'm sure, is journaling. So I've done it a bit myself, but, I'm pulling out the daily prompt from journaling app one day in today's episode and asking you, what is the one fact about the world that amazes you?
Oh gosh. Well, let's say we're still processing. This is in the order of still processing what has happened in the US and I guess around the world lately. I am going to say I am amazed at how many people are so incurious about how things actually work and insist they know how things work. The simplification of the world and the lack of curiosity about reality really amazes me lately.
In respect to what? Everything.
Yeah, everything. Just this idea that, there's so much discussion. And it goes to the stuff we talk about too, that people think all of these things are really easy. Get rid of the bad stuff online, keep the good stuff. Oh, the government is a mess because of, stupidity and graft and corruption. Therefore, we can hire Elon Musk to go into the government and get rid of $2 trillion worth of spending. No problem. Is kind of, it's a lack of intellectual curiosity that is astounding to me.
Yeah.
But what is a fact in the world that amazes you, Ben?
Well, for all the departure from Musk's platform over the last week, and for all of the people who are showing up on other platforms, including Blue Sky, I was amazed to see this week that actually it was Threads that grew a Blue Sky amount. It grew 50 million users in November. So it has already surpassed the number of users Blue Sky has. And that to me is astounding and shocking. And we need to get into that, Mike. We've got to talk about this.
All right, let's do it.
Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's November the 15th, 2024, and this week's episode is brought to you with the financial support of the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. My name is Ben Whitelaw. I do know what date it is, just about. And I'm with Mike Masnick, who I'm less sure he does know what day it is.
This has been many years in a couple weeks.
Yeah. How's the week been? Have you gone any further in processing what's happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like the whole world is crazy right now. And, and some of, as we'll discuss, there's a bunch of stuff going crazy with Blue Sky. And so partly because of my association with Blue Sky, I've been spending some time thinking about that and talking to folks there. And then, there's a whole bunch of other crazy stuff happening in the world. And it's just, day after day of what crazy thing is going to happen today is, it's a little bit disconcerting.
Yeah, and we should say for new listeners that Mike is on the board of Blue Sky. So that's what he means when he says about his affiliation. So Mike, let's get straight into the stories then, because there's no time like the present. And we're going to start with Blue Sky. We're going to start with a story that many people have seen this week, where the Guardian newspaper has decided that it's going to come off of X/Twitter because of concerns about safety. There's a few stories interconnected here that you're really interested in, and some of that involves the departure of users to other platforms. Talk us through them.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting. So first, the Guardian announced that they were quitting X and basically just said they were upset about the content on the platform and how it was being moderated and how it was being handled. And so in the wake of the election, they decided they were no longer posting to it. That's not a Blue Sky story because the Guardian hasn't, as far as I've seen, hasn't set up on Blue Sky at all.
Yep.
But, they decided they weren't going to do it. And then some other news organizations followed as well. There's the Spanish newspaper. I'm not going to be able to pronounce it. La Vanguardia? Is that
right? That's all
right. So they also announced that they were quitting, but then just a whole bunch of users have been quitting. And there have been some reports, and obviously the internal data exactly from X is not available, but I believe it was Simple Web, which tracks where people go on the web. They have a bunch of ways, some sneakier than others, to see where people are on the web. Notice that traffic to the delete your account page on X went up through the roof, like massively. It's actually kind of impressive. You can, if you see the chart that they put out. And so a whole bunch of people have been leaving and going elsewhere. And almost all of it is just in response to the election. And people, well, there are a few things. Also, as we record today, X's new terms of service have gone into effect. And they were announced about a month ago. And they include a few things such as that anyone that X chooses can train AI off of the data that you have given to the platform. Previously, X itself could, but now basically they can sell the data that you have given to X. And so a lot of people were upset about that. So a whole bunch of people started deleting their accounts. A lot of it is just sort of reaction to the election and saying, do we really want to be on this platform at a time when Elon has been basically like, it appears, running part of the transition process and giving recommendations on who should be in the Trump administration. There was some talk that he's sort of camping out at the Trump residence in Mar-a-Lago. In fact, there were some reports that people within the transition team were sort of getting sick of Elon Musk, which would be interesting soap opera to watch. But, it does seem that there has been a mass exodus of people from the platform going to other places. And so some of that is Threads, absolutely. As you mentioned in your amazing fact of the of the week, Threads claims that they've gotten 15 million new users. But Blue Sky, and again, disclaimers, I'm on the board, I'm associated with the company. They've seen massive growth as well. And so in the last few days, millions of users have come in. You said 15 million users is Blue Sky. That is no longer true.
Is it gone up even further?
It is now 17 million users. Actually, in the time that we are recording this, it just passed 17 million users about 30 seconds ago as we're recording, as I look at the numbers. So Blue Sky now has 17 million users, and that is growing very rapidly. Yesterday, on Thursday, was the first day that over 1 million users posted during the day.
Interesting.
And so, the numbers are looking really interesting. And the thing that I had seen in the past when there have been events, they're sort of referred to as Elon Musk events, EMEs, that cause people to run to Blue Sky, it had usually been sort of one big shot. So when X got banned in Brazil, or when he announced the new policy, there would be one day where there would be a huge rush of people to Blue Sky, and then it would start to trail off. People would sort of check it out and go away. That hasn't been happening this time. It has been sort of this gradual growth each day, bigger and bigger for the past week. I don't know if that'll keep going, but it's been interesting to see. And a lot of people are saying that they feel like that it's reached critical mass. I don't know if that's really true or not, but it's interesting to see that a lot of people are, deciding that they want to go elsewhere. And the fact that The Guardian and other media publications are saying, X just might not be worth it anymore, seems worth noting. We have had some other media properties that have left in the past. NPR famously got into a spat with Elon where he called them state media, which is kind of interesting now that Elon has apparently decided to accept a role in the government. Does that make X now state media? Does it make Truth Social state media? There are all of these interesting questions that seem to open up issues of potential hypocrisy on the part of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. But
surely not.
But I do think it's interesting that for a very long time, really for 2 years since Elon took over the company, and it's been just over 2 years since he took over the company, there'd been this sense that people are going to go somewhere else, but then it didn't happen. And sort of the power of inertia was very, very strong in keeping people on Twitter/X. And it's totally understandable. It's like, it's not easy to start over somewhere else. Yeah. And it does feel like in the last week with the election and with the changing of the terms of service and everything else, that there is at least a more concerted effort to say, you know what, it's really time to leave. And we'll see what does that mean for X in the future. It still has a lot of users, but if it's dwindling, that becomes more difficult to sustain. There is the argument that, and there have been lots of talk about the valuation had gone down, the advertising had dropped by like 80%, though there was a report in the FT this week expecting that advertisers would suddenly return to X as they, as it says, seek favor with Elon Musk and Donald Trump. That feels really speculative to me, and I'm not sure I buy it. I'm not sure that's necessarily the best way to seek favor in this situation. And as users are leaving, it becomes an even less and less desirable place to put advertising. But, we're seeing a reshaping of the world in a lot of ways, both in the government and in what the social media landscape looks like. And I think that's interesting at a time when, we had all these years where people were saying, it was never going to change, that we had Facebook and we had Twitter and we had YouTube, and there was no way that any other, the world was set. That was the way things were going to go. And, the only disruption we had seen to that for years was TikTok, which sort of came out of nowhere and built up a really, really big presence. But everything else, it was sort of the suggestion that you could never take on these companies. And we're seeing things change. And we're in the midst of that disruption and change right now. We don't know exactly where it's going to end up, but it's kind of exciting to see what comes of this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're right to point out the kind of seismic shift in the user behavior that we're seeing. You can dispute the numbers and say that 15 million users or 9 million on Mastodon isn't anywhere near the size of these other platforms, but it's again the biggest shift we've seen in a while. I want to come on to the brand exodus in a second, but around the kind of exodus of users, we haven't really seen, we were talking ahead of the recording, we haven't seen a lot of this happen previously. There's a couple of examples in the past where users have basically decided based upon the platform policy or some changes on the platform to depart directly as a result of that. I was thinking about how Tumblr changed its adult content guidelines, I think in 2018, and that led a lot of Tumblr users to leave. And obviously Tumblr is really a shell of a platform as it was prior to that, and has really changed hands a few times since then, and really isn't the kind of interesting platform that it used to be. You were also talking about Dig as an example of when this happened.
That was the one that sprung to mind as the biggest example. There are others. Obviously, there was a grand migration from Friendster, which was sort of one of the first social networks, to MySpace, and then from MySpace to Facebook. But those all seem sort of more gradual. The one that struck me as the most closely related to this was Dig to Reddit. And for folks who don't know, in sort of 2008, 2009 timeframe, Dig was huge and was sort of it's funny what the tagline of Reddit now is, the front page of the internet. People went there for news and would vote up and down news, very much like Reddit. They sort of really created that kind of model. And the founder of Dig was on the cover of Business Week as like this super successful kid. I think they called him a kid on the cover of Business Week magazine.
He just deals with this funny thing called the internet.
Yeah. I think they had him in like a funny outfit too. And he was like wearing like Walkman headphones or something. It was something so dumb. But Dig made massive changes. Like they basically changed their entire system. And there were reasons for that, which a lot of it had to do with the fact that the way Dig was originally set up, it was totally open to gaming, and people could push themselves up to the top of the ratings with a little bit of trickery. And as the people in the trust and safety world know, when you leave it open for trickery to occur, it will, and that creates real problems. And so Dig tried to deal with that, but in doing so, they really changed their entire system and the way it works, and it just sort of completely set people off. And Reddit had actually been out there in existence for a couple of years, had come out of Y Combinator, and had really sort of puttered along. And there was for a long period of time, people sort of looked at, Dig was the big successful company, and Reddit was this like, kind of also ran, wasn't going to be very successful. And in fact, at one point, Reddit had sold out fairly cheaply to Condé Nast, and Condé Nast had like put them in the corner of Wired's offices. I once went to a meeting with an editor at Wired magazine for something, and he was like, "Oh, let me show you around the office." And he's like, "There's Reddit." It was like in the corner. It was
like a handful of people.
Yeah, it was like 4 guys sitting in the corner of Wired's offices.
Wow.
But when Dig made this change and changed their policies and changed their setup and the way it worked, people were like, this sucks and we're going to go somewhere else. And that was what made Reddit. And Reddit took off and Dig completely collapsed and ended up, it's changed hands a bunch of times. I don't even know if there's still a version of it out there. And so it's not a perfect analogy. Obviously, X was way bigger than Dig ever was. But I'm seeing some of that sense of people saying like, there's a point at which it crosses the line and we're not going to take it anymore. And if there are reasonable alternatives out there, we're going to go seek them out. And so it feels like that's what's happening. And it'll be really, really fascinating to watch, like, what is the end result of that?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that in almost, 20 years of social networks, and you can say whether it's longer than that, but, in a significant period of time, there's not that many examples of this kind of shift, I'd say, as a result of policy. And I think that is interesting. Again, you could debate whether there are other examples, but I do think this is notable for that reason. And the sheer fact that The Guardian is coming out so strongly, and you can disagree with its political views, but the fact that it came out so strongly with such strong wording around the toxicity of content on the platform, and the fact that Musk had used it as a political weapon, and the fact that Lavangardia had said specifically this is about its content moderation policies, is very much striking to me. These are major brands in their countries, in the case of The Guardian, big news outlets in the US and Australia too, deciding not to, at a time when journalism is struggling for audience and struggling for sustainability, saying actually, we don't agree with these policies and we're going to exit from a kind of principles perspective. I think that's notable in and of itself, irrelevant of what happens, right, to the user base and where it goes.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And there's a whole separate angle, which we probably don't want to go too deep on, but I attended an event earlier this week about all of these attempts to do what I refer to as sort of link taxes, or what some people refer to as bargaining codes, around getting tech companies to pay media properties. And the way that Meta in particular has responded to these, and Google to a lesser extent, has been to sort of threaten to block news. And in fact, they are doing that in Canada. And so I heard a report from people in Canada this week, which was very interesting, saying that the impact of Meta blocking any sharing of news in Canada has had a huge impact, especially on local news organizations. And there was a question that was asked of, would local newspapers prefer to have traffic from Meta or payments from Meta? And universally, people were saying the traffic is more important. And yet here's kind of a flip side story to it, which is saying like, this traffic is not worth it to us. Even if it is a way for us to get our news out there, it is not a platform that is worth it to us because of these other ancillary factors. And that's really interesting. There is this concept, and I think Nilay Patel at The Verge was the first one to sort of put it in these words, that for social media, content moderation is the product. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that. To get back to my strange fact my amazing fact at the beginning, people don't seem to really think this through. There is this belief, especially among like the Elon Musks of the world, that content moderation is somehow evil and a problem. Yet it is the product that makes the experience on your website what it is. And some people are realizing that, and there are consequences to that. And so when The Guardian, which is, obviously a huge, huge media operation, decides that it's just not worth it anymore, that's saying something about the need for good trust and safety and content moderation, or there are consequences.
Yeah. I mean, you talked there about the kind of interplay between platforms and publishers. Do you think this is going to have any difference on the metrics of the platform itself? Because The Guardian are obviously making a bet that they're not going to lose anything by not being on the platform. Yeah. Twitter has historically been a low driver of traffic for publishers. Facebook is very different to Twitter in that respect.
Yeah.
Do you think the platforms are likely to see any change in habits as users, if publishers decide to go down a route where they take their content off the platform? Will there be behavior changes as a result, do you think?
It will be interesting. I don't know. It is, there's a whole bunch of different factors here, because yes, historically, Twitter has never been as big a driver of traffic to publishers, but at the same time has been a major source of information where the journalists participate and the media, the folks in the media participate and have these discussions, they often find stories, they find sources, they find out about things. And as that moves around, I think it'll be really interesting as to how that impacts the media.
Yeah.
I also think it'll be interesting to see how, because these alternative platforms, Mastodon, Threads, and Blue Sky, are built in a different way than X/Twitter, specifically in the decentralization elements of them. I'm sort of curious to see if there will be some unique experiments that reshapes the way that people interact with the news. This is very, very speculative, and it's not like I'm thinking of like a perfect example right now. But the fact that these are in some ways, and they're very different ways, but these systems are more open to third parties building on them and doing experimentation. And so like Flipboard, which has been around for a while, but it is kind of a tool for finding and interacting with the news, has really very strongly embraced ActivityPub and Mastodon, and they're building a whole bunch of stuff related to it. And I think could change, there are these experiments that someone's going to crack the code that changes the way that people interact with news. And that could be good, could be bad, depending on how it comes out of it. Yeah. But for the first time in really a decade, it feels like we have this opening to change the way we interact with news. And that's both exciting and scary, right? Because we don't know how it's going to end up. Hopefully, it leads to something better, because there is a very strong argument the way that we've interacted with news for the last decade has maybe not been too good.
Fair.
If we can get to a point where there is a better way to interact with news, and this sort of shakeup allows that could be really exciting.
Yeah, and we're starting to see some journalists kind of go onto these other platforms, onto Blue Sky, onto Mastodon. It is worth noting that, back in the day, social platforms, particularly Twitter, did a big push to get journalists and media organizations onto platforms. I was working in a couple of newsrooms at the time, and we'd have a kind of partnerships manager, and they would come and they would court all the journalists, and they would say, we can give you verification, and if you just make sure that your work email account is attached to your address, then we can guarantee that it's you. We can give you the blue tick. And that was because they knew that journalists were producing content, which, as you say, is the product. They knew they had information that was valuable, and it was a habit driver for a lot of social platforms. And so as Threads and Blue Sky and others, I guess, see some of those content providers, and there's a bigger group of content providers than there was 10 or 15 years ago, right? It's not just journalists anymore, but that will be interesting to see how those behaviors shake out. I wanted to talk a bit about the brands piece as well, Mike, because there have been other brands, as you say, that have kind of left social media platforms in the past. We know that brands can remove advertising and can kind of take away what they spend on platforms as a way of having leverage over a platform's policies. But there's only a few examples that I remember of platforms stopping to publish content organically and not paying for it. A couple of examples I remember. One of them was Lush, actually still never posted on TikTok. If you go to Lush, which is a cosmetics company in the UK, maybe elsewhere, they actually have a video that basically just says, go outside and enjoy yourself. Like they made a big, which is a nice message. But it was in response to concerns at the time about mental health of social media users, of body image of social media users, and TikTok not necessarily doing much to address those. Balenciaga, the fashion brand, took itself off of Twitter when Musk joined the platform in 2022 and has not returned. It doesn't have an account at all now, as far as I can see. And do you know what the third example was I found of a brand taking itself off a platform?
Tell me.
Tesla and SpaceX.
Wait a second.
I'd forgotten all about this, but in 2018, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and after the kind of big pushback around Facebook's use of data, and there was a big campaign to delete Facebook. There was a hashtag was trending. Elon Musk decided that he was going to take Tesla and SpaceX's accounts off of Facebook. And they have never returned. There's no official Tesla account on Facebook. It had something like 2.5.
To this day, still?
To this day. Never.
Wow.
Never, yeah. So
Can I just note, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Can I just note, this is the same Elon Musk who is currently suing companies for refusing to advertise on X?
That very same.
Amazing.
Talk about having your cake and eating it.
Amazing.
So, there are very few examples, and this is what makes this story interesting and notable. And as you see from how long we've talked about it, I think there's a lot of different elements to it which make it fascinating.
Yeah, just the fact that there is this shakeup, I think, is really exciting and worth talking about. And I think it's going to lead to a lot of things to talk about in the next year, just because it's, everybody had sort of assumed that we had this set of companies to talk about. And the entire ecosystem is changing in really interesting ways, and nobody knows exactly how it's going to shake out. And everybody's making their individual decisions, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, indeed. We've done a fair chunk on that, Mike. So let's move now on to our next story. This is a continuation in some ways of a story we talked about last week on the podcast. So for listeners who didn't tune into that, we talked about Australia's proposed ban on social media for teenagers. And the update to that story was that the age had been set at which teenagers wouldn't be able to have an account on social media. And that age had been set for 16. And we touched on it very briefly. And a whole bunch of experts and academics have actually come out this week and written a letter about how unenforceable that legislation is going to be in practical terms. And we did discuss this, and the law is going to Parliament next week. So we'll be able to talk about it in the coming weeks. But what I want to concentrate on, Mike, is the fact that in the UK this week, there's been a number of stories about how the UK is actually in close pursuit of Australia, is following close behind in terms of developing laws around not only smartphone bans, but also social media bans as well. So just to kind of give you an overview, so there's essentially a Labour MP who's put forward a bill calling for the banning of smartphones. And initially, Labour and the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, wasn't that interested in this, said that kind of schools had the tools and the ability to ban smartphones, said it was a kind of unnecessary move. However, since then, we've seen this campaign spring up called the Smartphone Free Childhood Group. And it's attracted a lot of parents who have signed up for its manifesto. The manifesto talked about how childhood is fleeting, that technology should be a force for good, companies that profit from children must respect childhood, et cetera, et cetera. And it's got a very kind of clever sign-up process where you can not only pledge to the manifesto, but also then email your MP directly from the campaign page. So all of a sudden, MPs have got this swell of parents in their inboxes calling for a smartphone ban. And all of a sudden, this gap has opened. And according to reports this week that I've read, the Labour government is more open-minded and amenable to some form of ban for teens of some form. Now, it seems like from the reports that actually social media is a more likely ban than smartphones as a whole. Again, schools have the ability to ban smartphones and take them away, and we can talk a bit about that because there's been some interesting reporting on that. But it is interesting to note just how what's happening in Australia, as we always see with legislation and internet regulation, is already having a kind of impact. And we know that ministers in the UK are closely following what's happening there with a view to seeing if they should follow suit. So you're also seeing a bit of this in the States as well, right? We talked a bit about California being a place for this too. What do you make of all of this as a bit of a movement?
Yeah, I think we've talked about some of this before, where a lot of it just really feels not driven by the research or by reality, but by a general moral panic. And even like the framing of that campaign in the UK, it feels like the older generation going, the kids these days, in the same way that they always do, the kids these days, whether it was rock and roll or pinball or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever the kids were doing. Again, like I may have talked about this on the podcast before, but I don't remember exactly. You go back, there are examples of it when the waltz first came out, that the older generation complained that it was too sensual. When novels became popular in the 19th century, people said, well, all of this fiction stuff is rotting people's brains. When chess became popular in the 19th century, people said it was a waste of brain power to be moving little pieces around a board rather than being out in the fields working. This kind of thing happens all of the time. And yes, this is not to dismiss the concerns that people have about social media and smartphones and how they're used and all of these things. And I think those things are all worth studying, and it's worth thinking about how we do these things smartly. But the idea of an outright ban just consistently smacks of, we don't like this newfangled stuff, and so we're going to ban it. And I just think it's problematic, and I don't think it works well. And as all sorts of attempts at prohibition don't tend to work out well, there are reasons why many if parents are so concerned, then don't buy your kids a smartphone, right? But the fact is, like, lots of people have found smartphones to be really useful, and that includes for kids and for lots of reasons. And there have been, there were studies in Australia that were released earlier this year saying that bans of smartphones in school didn't work. In New York City, they banned smartphones in schools about a little less than a decade ago, and they rescinded the ban less than a year later because parents were complaining that it made it really difficult to reach their kids when they needed to, or to like find kids for pickup and all this kind of stuff. There are all of these consequences to this stuff. There's also the fact that with the phones in schools, phones have been useful in schools in documenting abuse by teachers, or in the US, we have a lot of police in schools, what are called school resource officers, SROs. Phones have been used to document abuse by those individuals in schools. And so there's this whole thing where you're banning them. Are you avoiding capturing of those kinds of problems? There are all sorts of consequences to these things that it feels like the sort of ban and block campaigns don't take into account. Yeah. It's not even getting into the whole questions around age verification, where if you're banning social media for those under 16 or whatever, how do you determine who's under 16? That raises a whole bunch of questions that nobody really wants to address. And so, I understand why these kinds of movements happen. I think historically, in retrospect, they always look kind of silly, and that there are better ways to deal with this, which tend to be around education and properly training people how to use these things in a way that is safer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a parent. We should talk about how, a little bit of how your kids' schools deal with it, because I think there's probably some interesting examples there. And for listeners who are tuning in, do get in touch with us to share examples of how your kids' schools are also thinking about this, because it seems like there's a lot of potential thought going into how to address some of these concerns, and we should engage with them. Get in touch with us, podcast@Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. I'm not a parent, Mike, but this is something that keeps coming up, and parents seem to say that if they don't give their child a smartphone, then they're worried about their kids falling behind, being bullied, being left out. Is that a kind of argument, do you think, for having legislation that bans it blanketly? Is that a strong enough argument?
Yeah, I'm not convinced of that entirely. I mean, not to get into too many details about sure. my situation in my family. Like, I have a child who is in high school who doesn't have a phone, though that might change soon. And it wasn't us saying like, no, you don't get a phone. It was that they didn't want a phone. and that was a choice that they have not expressed to us a desire for a phone. And therefore we didn't feel the need to force a phone on an unwilling child. But, they're reaching the age where it probably would be helpful for them to have a phone, and we're talking to them about it. But as part of that, preparing them how to use it properly and how to use it safely, and, what the risks are and things like that. But they are in a school where all of their friends do have phones. And one of the interesting things that we discovered in the high school is that for 9th and 10th grade students, the first 2 years of the high school, every classroom was given a board with pockets on it. So as you walk into the classroom, students are actually supposed to drop their phones into the pockets. So it's easy to get back access to the phone if you need it. It's not, some schools I know are having like lockers and your phone is locked away for the entire day. This is just for each class. You drop it in the thing. So, right. And some of the classes apparently take attendance that way. They look at which pockets have phones in them, which presented an immediate challenge for my kid who didn't have a phone, but who was able to explain to the teachers, and it worked out okay. But, there are ways to deal with it that are not as extreme as these sort of complete bans and blocks that I think are more effective. But then there are also stories like, I had heard, and I forget exactly where it was, of a student who was at a high school who wrote for the school newspaper, and they needed a phone because they were taking pictures for the school newspaper. And so they had to get a special exception that allowed them to carry a phone. And, if they were stopped by someone at the school, they could show I'm allowed to have a phone in school. there are a lot of things where it's like there are ways to handle these situations in a way that isn't as extreme as the government coming in and banning them. And I fear when you have the government say like, oh, we have to ban these things entirely, that the end result is you don't have room for those kinds of reasonable exceptions, or you just leads into everyone ignoring the rule. One of the things that came up when New York banned schools banned phones in schools a decade ago was that it tended to be mostly enforced against the less well-off schools and the less well-off students. And that is something that is also really important to think about. When you have a law, how is the enforcement taken out? And is that enforcement done in a discriminatory manner? And that's what we saw in New York with the school ban. And so I think it's worth thinking about these things rather than assuming that, oh, if we ban phones in schools, like all the kids run out to the fields and enjoy the outdoors again. It's not really the way it works.
No, it's interesting. There's an FT piece essentially asking the question of should smartphones be banned in schools? And it's kind of ironic. The case study, the school that it looks at, claims to have had great success taking kids' phones away, and they're locked away in a locker for the whole day. And the headmaster takes great pride in saying, actually, we only confiscated 4 phones over 2 months for 1,000 kids. And normally we'd be confiscating phones daily. And I was thinking like, great, well, let's just leave it like that then.
Right.
No need for any kind of stricter regulation than that if it's working. And again, this is a school in a kind of nice part of the world in the UK. To your point, probably a more well-off school than others. So different behaviors, different kinds of kids, different examples needed, I think. So I think it's really interesting just to see this emerge as a theme in the UK, particularly as we go into next year with the Online Safety Act, to see this emerge alongside probably questions around, as you say, age assurance, age verification. How do we ensure, if we're going to have social media bans as a subset of bans for teenagers, how are we going to ensure that is done in a way that is okay, is allowing people who need to access technology to be able to access technology and not locking people out of opportunities to do so.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, thanks, Mike. So we managed to get through that segment without mentioning Jonathan Haidt. So well done you for that.
You just ruined it. He is mentioned in a few of the articles.
Yeah, I know. You were being very restrained. Okay, so let's round up the kind of best of the rest. We didn't have a huge amount to go on. This has been a relatively quiet week, apart from the big stories that we've discussed. But you spotted a couple of interesting kind of effects of regulation, Mike, for some of the big platforms.
Yeah, there were some interesting things going on in the EU and responses from the big tech companies this week that I thought were sort of interesting to pay attention to in terms of specifically kind of how ads work in the EU in particular. Under the regulations in the EU, Facebook and Instagram, I think last year, started releasing a subscription product that was an ad-free subscription product, which was sort of mandated by the law. And as soon as they did that, and they had warned EU regulators that this would be the case, EU regulators started complaining that the prices for the subscription were too high. And what Meta said was basically like, well, if we're removing our ability to make money from ads and we have to make that up through subscription fees, this is what we need to do. And then so they were sort of getting hit both ways, which was that you have to offer an ad-free product, but then you can't price it as high as you want. And so this week, sort of in response to that, Meta responded with cheaper subscription plans. The announcement is a little bit petulant in terms of how they're responding to this. Like, okay, fine, the EU, we think this goes beyond what the EU requires, but okay, here we'll release cheaper plans. And they're also changing some of the things so that you can get a less personalized ad thing. And even this is kind of like a little bit snotty in the way it's announced, where it's like all of our efforts look like people say that they actually prefer the more targeted, more personalized ads. They're more relevant. They're more useful. Yeah. But if you're going to force us to, okay, we're going to give you a less good experience, which is a very self-serving and a little bit the way that they said it is like, despite our concerted efforts to comply with EU regulation, we have continued to receive additional demands from regulators that go beyond what is written in the law. It's basically like, all right, you're going to keep pushing us, we're going to do this. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. It's sort of the nature of how the companies are working. And a sort of similar story, though, on a different law, but still related to advertisements. Google this week announced that they were going to ban political advertising across the EU, across their products, which includes YouTube, which I think, is actually a pretty big area that is used for political advertisements. They're banning political advertisements across EU based on the regulation on transparency and targeting of political advertising, the TTPA. And basically what Google is saying is like, we warned you that these regulations were terrible and impossible to comply with, but you went ahead with them anyways. And we have no way to comply with them that aren't going to get us rung up on an investigation and then massive fines. And therefore, we are just banning political ads altogether. And again, it feels a little bit bratty in the response because it's kind of like, haha, you politicians who rely on political advertising to get elected and to get word out on what your policies are, you're not going to be able to do that on our platform. And we're just sort of pulling out of that market altogether.
Yes, there's a little bit of like, be careful what you wish for in the response to both of these stories, which I think is interesting. It also ties back a little bit to what you were saying about the news carrier legislation in Canada, right? It's like, again, we were trying to help you get your journalism to your audiences in ways that you weren't able to do before, and you made money off the back of us, and now you've taken that away. So we're going to have to, punish you. And and there's a kind of thread that runs through there of, I guess, politicians, media being so reliant on these platforms now that actually when regulation comes to pass, the impacts aren't necessarily known. And I think this is an example that we don't necessarily know what this is going to mean in the EU for politicians or for voters. Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. And some people respond to this and say, well, this is more evidence that the companies have too much power or whatever. And maybe that's true. But like the reality is if like you create regulatory incentives, then companies are going to respond to those incentives. And that's one of my frustrations with a lot of the regulatory proposals are that they assume we put this regulation in place and nothing changes. Like the market will just act the same way and we're going to be able to extract something from that or cause something to change. But the regulation creates incentives and companies are going to respond to those incentives because that's what they need to do. That's what businesses do.
Yeah. Do you think that there is a downside to this? Obviously, you kind of alluded to the idea that politicians won't be able to campaign on these Google platforms, won't be able to kind of try and drive people to vote for them. Do you think people will miss political advertising on Google products?
Does anyone ever miss political advertising? I don't know. I mean, that is a big question, but it will be interesting to see what does that mean long term. And, like the impact of political advertising is different in different kinds of campaigns for different kinds of offices and is different in different countries because different countries also have different regulations and how political advertising works as well.
Yeah.
But it is something to watch and it is something to pay attention to if they're banning political ads entirely. I think it's got to have some sort of impact.
Yeah. I feel like part of this podcast, Mike, is just us coming up with like research questions that we can't answer.
Yes.
That we're hoping somebody else, potentially a listener, is able to answer at some point down the line.
Yeah.
I think that this is one of them. Again, I would love to be able to kind of track the kind of knock-on effect of this. Let's kind of do a couple more stories before we wrap up. I mean, this is a very lighthearted story. This is maybe as far away from the US election as you can get from the last couple of weeks. But I was really taken by this Gizmodo story, Mike, about the latest English town to be affected by Facebook's moderation algorithms. There's a place called Coulsdon, just outside of London. Kind of unspectacular place. You wouldn't necessarily go there. It's not cool. I've never been.
Okay.
I don't think I plan to. But there's a local.
You can go do research for this story.
I could. Maybe I'll drop by. Maybe I'll go and find the owner of this Facebook group, whose case was reported in the local press after a number of different posts got moderated over a period of weeks. I think dozens at a time, and they were very miffed about why this was. And it turns out that Coulsdon, which is spelled Coulsden, Facebook's moderation algorithms thought that they were peddling drugs. specifically LSD. so this is
right in the middle.
Because right in the middle of Causden is LSD. And so this is the latest in a number of stories like this. I remember one about Plymouth Hoe, a place in the south of the UK. Your favorite is right up in the north of the UK.
Yeah. I mean, people have a name for this sort of situation, and it's called the Scunthorpe problem because of Scunthorpe, which has a word in the middle of it that is potentially problematic if you build a filter that is just based on words alone. And so it's generally referred to as the Scunthorpe problem because of that. And the amazing thing to me is that this is still a problem for a company as large as Facebook. And we've talked about this recently, about Instagram and Threads and some of their moderation tools, and just how surprised we were at how simplistic the filters appeared to be.
Yeah.
And this is just another example. And I'm kind of shocked that a Scunthorpe type problem would still pop up from a Meta product.
Yeah, totally. And the response is always the same from the companies, which this is a technical glitch. This is an error. We've now fixed this. Yes. What it means is somebody has gone into the tooling and taken out LSD from the filtering for whatever period of time until I guess they have an issue down the line and they have to re-add it or do it in certain way. So yeah, it's funny. We are in this never-ending cycle, I guess, of poor UK towns being caught up in moderation filters. And I will not stand for it, Mike.
I was going to say, I mean, the UK has a way with naming its towns. So,
yeah, indeed, we should come up with a list of other problematic ones.
Well,
for a future episode.
There's a podcast called Hollywood Babylon, put on by Kevin Smith, who's the filmmaker who made Clerks and other stuff. And they have this segment that they do semi-regularly, which is called "Your Town's Got a Fucked Up Name." and people submit all of these random towns, and I would say half of them are probably in the UK.
Oh, really?
They are examples of just problematic names in whatever sense.
Yeah.
And so maybe we need the trust and safety version of Your Town's Got a Fucked Up Name.
Yeah. Makes me proud to be British. Great. And finally, Mike, we will round up on the final story, because we started today's podcast talking about the ex-users who are leaving the platform, who are departing, but there is an awful lot of users still there, by some counts 150 million daily users. And you spotted a couple of stories that relate to those users who are still on the platform.
Yeah, the one that really caught my eye was this one from Rest of World covering how phony X accounts are, as they say, meddling in the election in Ghana. And this is the kind of story that isn't that surprising, because we've certainly seen other accounts in the past of efforts to influence elections using social media. But this struck me as interesting timing and sort of a sense of what is happening with X now. And there is a clear idea that outside of maybe US and Europe, or specific countries that are of interest to US and Europe, that X doesn't care at all. And you sort of get that sense that there are these sort of fairly obvious bot accounts. Some of them are operated obviously using ChatGPT or other generative AI tools to create political propaganda and present it as if, there's like a widespread support for the existing leading party. And the sense here is that X has sort of given up on moderating these kinds of things. If it's not something that matters to Elon Musk, the trust and safety at X doesn't exist effectively. And this is like, it's in some sense, it takes you back to the way that, a lot of these concerns happened a decade ago, when sort of trust and safety was first coming up as being so important. You would hear these stories of places that are not generally paid attention to by folks in the US or Europe that were getting ignored, and terrible things were happening, and massacres and genocides were popping up, and people were using these platforms to do stuff, and they were totally ignored. And so this just caught my eye. It's not, this is not as extreme as that, but as an example that these kinds of election meddling are apparently now going on X almost entirely unimpeded from the sense of it. Struck me as really interesting. There's a related story. It's not quite the same thing, but DFR Lab put out this report recently about a network of sock puppets impersonating Americans and Canadians and pushing particularly pro-Israel content on X. And there's an interesting question of again, how is X handling these kinds of trust and safety thing where you have these faked accounts? I think I didn't look as closely there. I'd seen a report actually a couple months ago that was presented at the Trust and Safety Research Conference, where one of the ways they were identifying these faked accounts, and these look like the same kinds of ones, was if they were using this face generation app, AI, that would always put the eyeballs in the exact same spot in the profile photos. And so you could determine which ones were faked by just lining up their eyes. And just looking at some of these faked accounts, I see all of their eyes are in exactly the same position. So I'm thinking it's the same sort of thing. But it's kind of interesting to see basically how X in particular seems to have given up on dealing with these kinds of problems right now.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm just going through each of the accounts, and they've all been suspended or been taken down as a result of this report, which I guess is the importance of ensuring that this research happens and that people stay on top of this. So a real range of stories today, Mike. A lot of X, Twitter departures, a lot of concern about safety. But yeah, thanks again for your analysis and for your thoughts. And for those who are listening and want to kind of leave a review for today's episode, who enjoyed our chat through this week's stories, go to your podcast platform of choice, leave us a review, give us a rating. It really helps us get discovered on the big wide world web. And we'll speak to you all next week.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.